Chapter 7.
Good God, Sheriff,
ejected Joe Dems.
you mean that Kitty was that dead man's wife?
And Harold Morgan echoed, Ms. Fred Ralston, with his mouth hanging open stupidly. Kitty flashed a look of utter scorn upon Dems.
All right,
she gritted between her teeth.
So now you know. I was married to him, and I have been married to him for 10 loathsome years, and I hate him. Do you hear me? I despised him. I'm glad he's dead. I should have done it myself 10 years ago.
She sank down to the floor, sobbing wildly. Dems shook his head and muttered to Pat,
I knew Kitty was married to a man whom she hated, but I didn't know his name.
Pat Stevens leaned down and caught hold of Kitty's arm. He lifted her up gently and led her to the bed. Have a seat here, ma'am. Soon as you're feeling able, we'll go on with our chat. Dems caught his arm as he turned away from her.
What do you think this means, Sheriff? You don't think she murdered her husband?
Pat said stolidly, I'm trying not to do too much thinking right now. When she gets over her crying spell, we'll see what she's got to say. He walked over to the whiskey bottle that was still sitting on the tray between the two chairs and picked it up and pulled the cork out. He put the neck of the bottle to his mouth and drank deeply, sighed and mopped sweat from his face when he set the bottle down. He got out his makings and slowly rolled a cigarette as he turned back towards the other two men in the room. Kitty lay face down on the bed, and her bare shoulders shook with sobs. Harold Morgan was regarding her wonderingly, and Dems had stepped back to sit down on the bench in front of the dresser. Pat got his cigarette rolled and put a fire to the end of it. He went to the bed and leaned over to touch Kitty's bare shoulder with his hard fingertips. Well, that ought to be enough crying, he told her. We're still waiting to get the rest of this killing.
I see it now, Dems broke in harshly. Sam was in here with her, and they were half drunk together. He was probably making love to her. In the meantime, her husband was checking into the room next to hers without her knowing it, and then he walks in on them. It would naturally make him mad to find another man in his wife's bedroom, so he must have jumped Sam, and then Sam...
We'll let the lady tell it, Pat interrupted him. Kitty rolled over on her side and peered up at him out of tear-dimmed eyes.
It was awful, she choked out. I thought Fred was in Denver, and Sam was here with me. There wasn't anything wrong in that. None of you have a right to make anything wrong out of us having a drink together.
She sat up and blinked at them defiantly. No one's saying what's wrong or what's right. Just go on and tell us what happened, Pat soothed her.
Sam was asking me to marry him.
Kitty drooped her head and laced her eyes together nervously in her lap.
I was having a hard time putting him off, she confessed. I was afraid to tell him that I was already married.
She lifted her head defiantly and told Pat,
I'd have married Sam if I had been free. I want you to believe that. I like him a lot. I guess I love him. If a woman like me can love a man, that is.
Her voice was harsh with bitterness in the last words. Pat replied gently, I reckon I believe you, ma'am. It makes me feel better. Go on ahead.
The door opened, Kitty said tonelessly, and there was Fred, my husband. He stood there sneering at us.
Which door? Said Pat.
That one.
Kitty indicated the door into number 15. And you don't know how it got unlocked?
No, I don't. Unless Fred got in there somehow and unlocked it before I came up into my room.
Go on.
Sam, he jumped up and began swearing at him for breaking into a lady's room. And then Fred laughed and said, That's no lady, you fool. That's my wife. And then Fred began to curse and threaten him, and well, then I guess Sam thought he was reaching in his pocket for a gun."
Kitty shuddered at the recollection.
"And before I could stop him, he had his knife out and was on top of Fred. And it was awful. He was terribly drunk, you see."
She appealed to Pat.
"That makes a difference, doesn't it, in the eyes of the law?"
Pat shook his head. "I'm not the judge, and I'm not the jury."
"Drunkenness won't make any difference,"
Dems put in.
"Not for a man who kills a woman's husband after he caught them together. Anybody knows that's murder."
Without looking at Dems, Pat said, "You'd be better to keep your mouth out of this. Go on ahead, ma'am. What happened then?"
"Well, I told you that Sam was terribly drunk. He toppled over on top of Fred, passed out. I couldn't move him, and I was frantic. So I rushed out of the hall, and then I remembered Ezra. I knew he'd help me, or help Sam, so I ran and knocked on his door, and I got him to come here, and he picked Sam up and carried him out. He was groaning about you being sheriff and finding it out," she went on swiftly. "And I remembered that I had heard you were turning your badge over to Jeff Perdot tonight. And some men say Jeff isn't as honest as he could be. But I don't know about that, but I remembered it, and I told Ezra I thought maybe we could fix things. You know, by paying Jeff to keep it quiet."
Kitty paused to wring her hands together, and then went on in a pleading tone.
"You see, I feel responsible. It was all my fault. And I knew Sam had struck out in self-defense, but I also knew that it would be called murder because of the circumstances, with Fred being my husband and all. So I made Ezra promise not to do anything until I could try and fix things up with Jeff. I thought if I told him the truth," she faltered uncomfortably, "and if Sam and Ezra offered to pay him, he might help us get rid of Fred's body or fix up a different story or something. I know it was terrible, but what else could I do?"
"And then," Pat said, "you found out that I was still sheriff instead of Jeff?"
"Yes."
"Where do you come into it?" Pat growled, whirling to look directly at Joe Dems. "You were mighty dead set that I shouldn't come up here. You even pulled a gun to try and stop me. Why were you worried?" Dems compressed his lips and cleared his throat.
"Well, I knew something was wrong. Kitty saw you from the back when you first walked into the saloon. She called me and begged me to keep you away from up here. I didn't know why. She didn't tell me it was murder, but she said that it would have been bad for hotel for business. So I did my best to stop you."
"Where are Sam and Ezra now?" Harold Morgan asked suddenly. Pat turned to look at Kitty.
I guess that Sam's probably in his room," she said. "I've seen him get drunk like that before, but it generally lasts all night. I don't know about Ezra, though. I haven't seen either one of them since." She paused to shudder. "Since Ezra carried Sam out of here."
"Well, we better unlock Sam's door and go over and arrest him," Dems said importantly. "I'll go down and get an extra key." "Get one for Ezra's room, too," Pat called after him.
You're not going to arrest Sam, are you?"
Kitty arose and came towards the sheriff. Her eyes were dry and they burned into his.
"He didn't mean any harm. He was drunk, and it's all my fault. Every bit of it. If I had told him I was married, it would have never even happened."
Despite his prejudice against her, Pat felt a surge of sympathy for the woman who stood before him pleading for Sam's life. It seemed to him he sensed an essential honesty and decency inside her which belied the painted face and sensually bared bosom. He found himself believing, by God, that she had been in love with Sam, strange as it was that any woman could love that dark, ugly little man. He said slowly, "I don't know how things will work out, ma'am. Sam will have to take his chance, I reckon. It never pays to fool with the law. Bribing a sheriff ain't never right, even if it does look like a good idea at the time." Color came swiftly to Kitty's cheeks.
I didn't mean that. I wouldn't think of trying to bribe you, Sheriff.
Joe Dems stuck his head into the door and announced, I've got those keys, Sheriff. Pat went out, followed by Harold Morgan and Kitty. Dems inserted a key into the door on the other side of the hall and opened the door with a flourish as though he was pulling rabbits out of a silk hat. He stepped back to let Pat enter the room first. Pat stopped on the threshold and said, Sam? There was no response from the dark room. Pat struck a match and walked in and found a candle on the dresser and lit it. The others crowded in through the doorway as he turned and lifted the flickering candle high above his head. The bed was rumpled and unmade, and there was a litter of Sam's clothes on chairs and on the floor, but there was no Sam. Pat even got down and peered under the bed and pulled the curtain aside that made a clothes closet out of one corner of the room.
He must be in the next room with Ezra,
Dems grated in a disappointed tone.
Want me to unlock that door, Sheriff?
Knowing full well that Ezra was at that moment riding southward with money stolen from the bank, Pat had to play the farce out as though he actually thought Ezra was in the next room. He said hastily, Well, better let me knock first. If he's protecting Sam, he'll more'n likely send lead through the door if he hears someone unlocking it. He went out and handed the candle to Morgan and stepped to the narc's door and knocked loudly. Ezra! Open up, Ezra. This is Pat. He waited a moment and then added loudly, It's Pat. I'm coming in, Ezra. Don't be making things worse by starting shooting. He stepped back and nodded for Dems to unlock the door. Dems cautiously stood far back to one side and held the key at arm's length as he inserted it into the lock. Pat took the candle from Morgan and walked in. Ezra's room also was empty. It bore more signs of hurried flight than had Sam's. The dresser drawers were open and emptied onto the floor, and everything was in the utmost confusion.
It seems that both of them is gone,
Dems muttered in an odd tone to Pat.
How you reckon they got out?
Are you sure they didn't go down the back stairs?
They couldn't. The stairs lead right into the kitchen and dining room where the help eat. There's always someone there. It looks like they just plain evaporated.
The single window in the room was open from the bottom. Pat went to it and uttered an exclamation, then leaned out and held the flickering candle to look down towards the ground. Dems hurried to his side and saw the rope with one end tied around the foot of the bed and running to the window and out.
So that's how they did it. Got clean away while we were sitting there talking. You better get after them in a hurry, Sheriff.
I don't need you to tell me my business, Dems. If you'd told me as soon as you knew something was wrong, this probably wouldn't even happen. He pulled himself back inside and set the candle down on the dresser. If I know Sam and Ezra, they'll be plenty of miles away by now.
Do you intend to just stand here and let them escape?
Dems demanded. Pat didn't pay any attention to him. He said to Morgan, You'll have to stay deputized. You've heard everything that went on here tonight, and you'll be able to swear to it. All right, Pat. What are you gonna do? Well, I'll be plenty busy with a bank robbery and a murder all in one night.
And what about Jeff Perdot?
Morgan protested. Why not put him in charge here, seeing that he's to be sworn in sheriff tomorrow? Pat's features tightened grimly. I aim to have a talk with Jeff Perdot right now. Like to have you sit in on it as well, Morgan. We might learn something that'll tie up with what happened here tonight. He turned and stalked out of the room, and Harold Morgan followed him. They went downstairs together and out on the boardwalk, and Main Street was deserted again, and all the citizens who weren't in the posse were gathered in saloons excitingly discussing the bank robbery. Pat stopped at the Gold Eagle and stuck his head between the swinging doors to ask, Hear anything from the posse yet? A series of no's answered him. Men began hurling eager questions at him, but he withdrew and went on towards the jail with Morgan at his side. "They don't know the half of it," Morgan said. "If they knew about that dead man up in the Jewel Hotel, they'd really have something to talk about tonight." Pat muttered some reply and kept on going. Keeping pace with him, the rancher said nervously, "I'm mighty sorry about Sam. I know how it hits you, Pat, you and him being such good friends." Pat said, "Well, Sam, he's always been one for getting into trouble." "That man was knifed in the back," Morgan said hesitantly. "I don't know whether you noticed it or not. I didn't want to say anything like that back at the hotel." "I noticed it." He didn't amplify the flat statement. "That's what'll make it go so hard on Sam if he's caught," said Harold Morgan. "Making love to a married woman and killing her husband when he catches you is bad enough, but a knife in the back, it makes one hell of a lot worse." Pat nodded and agreed hopelessly. "Sam never was one to do things by halves. When he gets into trouble, you can trust him to make it bad trouble." "Do you think you'll catch him, Pat?" Morgan spoke in a low tone as they approached the adobe jail and lean-to office. "I sure wouldn't blame you if you don't try too hard. Like the woman said, the whole thing was her fault. Women like her ought to be hung. Dragging a man like Sam into a mess like that." Pat said, "Sam and Ezra will be together. I reckon I know where to look for 'em, and that's why I'm leaving you deputized and in charge of the sheriff's office. I'll be riding alone after Sam and Ezra." "Do you think you got to? Couldn't you maybe just ride in the wrong direction?" "I'm still sheriff of Powder Valley, whether I like it or not." He stopped in front of the padlocked door of the adobe jail and called, "Jeth, you asleep in there?" Morgan looked at him in surprise, as though he thought Pat had suddenly gone insane. "This here's the jail. The office is round behind." "I know it's the jail. That's where I left Jeth." Getting no reply to his call, he produced a big iron key and unlocked the barred door, and it creaked loudly on rusty hinges as he pulled it open. He peered inside into the dark interior, called again, "Jeth, come on out." He grunted with surprise when this brought no answer either. He struck a match and held the tiny flame in front of him. Its flickering light showed a body huddled on the bare dirt floor in front of the small barred window. Pat stepped forward with Morgan right behind him. Neither of them had anything to say as they looked down at the bloody hole in Jeth Pardo's face where his nose had been. End of chapter 7.